It's great to be here. I'm very pleased to be asked to come and talk to you today, and it's a great honour. Basil didn't tell me what he was going to say, and there's one of the words that he used in his introduction that I take great exception to. When he says I'm retired, so I no longer work for the Royal Navy, but I didn't retire due to age. I just want to say I'm much younger than I look. I simply changed jobs midlife, I think is the phrase. So when I stand up in front of a group to speak like this, I have a dilemma. I have a choice to make. I either look at the audience, or I put on my reading glasses and look at my notes. I can't do both, and so the choice is. When I look around, I think I'll just look at my notes. I think it'll be easier. Can I start by asking, is there anyone in the audience who self-identifies as an historian? God, right. So I'd ask historians to ignore any of my references to history. And just nod along and say that it's okay. Love history, hate historians, I think is the way ahead. How to take a fascinating subject and make it turgid. That's your job. When I first started thinking about this lecture, when I was asked to do it at the tail end of 2025, I thought about it quite a lot. I thought I was going to give a warning. I thought my arguments were that we were drifting forwards into a world in which war at sea, in particular, could return in slow motion by stealth, without anyone really admitting what it was, to say that we were at war. But a week or two ago, Zelensky called it out. He said World War III. Others have used the terminology as well. And then the events of the past few days, well, I think that makes the warning that I thought I was giving less hypothetical. So US-Israeli strikes in Iran, Iran's retaliation, the threats to global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, all of these give us a stark reminder that the boundary between peace and crisis, and between crisis and war, is invisible. I would argue today there is no boundary. And my fear, and my starting point today, is that we're now living with multiple overlapping theatres where major powers are engaged in sustained confrontation that looks more and more like war. Even if our political vocabulary shies away from that, look out of the window and see what's going on. I find it disturbing that before standing up to give a lecture that I thought about at least 3 months ago, I have to check the news to see what's happening and see if I'm still right. And I don't know what the latest is, but about 20 minutes ago, I saw that an Iranian ship has been sunk off Sri Lanka. So, off my script for a minute before I go to my next slide, can I just throw out a general question, and maybe the historians do want to answer this one. When did the Second World War start? It's not a hypothetical question, it's a real question. When did the Second World War start?
1st of September 1935.
1st of September. Well, the UK didn't declare war on the 1st of September. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September. The UK declared war on the 3rd of September. At what time? 11 o'clock. So we can be pretty specific. Except, I would argue, depends where you live. So if you lived in the United States of America, your Second World War didn't start until what? December 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. If you lived in Manchuria, it was probably 1931. So context is everything. Where you live is everything, and that's reasonably straightforward and easy, I think. When did the Second World War end? Well, we know that VE Day was something, whatever date it was, in 1945, and VJ Day was a month or two later. But depending on where you live, did the Second World War end for you when your village in Normandy was liberated in 1944 and your life went back to some kind of normality? Or was it with the death of Hitler or the surrender of Nazi Germany? Or is it the impact of war that we're talking about? Did war actually end with, I don't know, the end of when was it? Of rationing in 1952? Or did the war end when we stopped paying the debt off in Tony Blair's government in whatever year that was? So when is the start? When is the end? Let's get away from thinking of pure, accurate, precise dates. Because I think it's important how we imagine war. I think if you stop someone in the street in the UK and ask what war is, they'll probably react instinctively, and it'll probably look something like the Second World War. It's probably something like Saving Private Ryan if you've seen the film. And in researching for this lecture, I read an interesting article about how Steven Spielberg in this film has probably shaped our perception, by ours I mean UK, US, Western perceptions of war over the last 3 decades than probably anything else. That's an opinion in an article, but I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it. And so I think popular culture, especially films and documentaries, however memorable they are, they give a mental picture. It's a cinematic moment in its own right, and that mental picture sticks with us, and that's how we interpret things and understand things. And the picture isn't necessarily wrong. Some wars are still fought like that, and we can think of Ukraine today. But popular culture and film shapes how we think about future war as well. Especially with AI, machine learning, robots. And so this image, any cinematic followers? Anybody know where the image is from? You're probably all too young. Well, some of you are too young. This is an image from James Cameron's Terminator 2. Great film. Los Angeles after the nuclear engagement, after machine systems became sentient on the 29th of August 1997. Well, the date was a bit wrong, but we're not far off AI becoming completely sentient, I think. And so I think it's images and cultural references like these that help fuel concern and distrust of things like machine learning and AI. Plus the fact that, I don't know if you've seen the studies, hit some headlines recently, that in AI war games, and there's a professor that I know called Ken Payne at KCL, who ran a series of simulations, 21 simulations. In 95% of those simulations, this was about a week or two ago, 95% of those simulations, those scenarios, resulted in a tactical nuclear exchange between the belligerents. Because, well, for probably many reasons, but because it was the logical thing to do, because the machine didn't think of emotion and culture and natural taboos and thresholds. It was told to win the war. None of the simulations went to strategic nuclear war. they stopped at tactical. If you're sitting under a mushroom cloud, does it matter if someone calls that tactical or strategic to you? Probably not. And so I think the thing about popular culture is not that it's invariably wrong, because it isn't. I think it's because it blinds people, including politicians, to other ways in which states and non-states might fight each other. So, if we look at how war is looked at and backed up on news reporting and the images, most often they support our original conceptions. The news images that we see reinforce our mindset. This is Bat Yam in Israel following an Iranian strike during the 12-day war in June 2025. It supports what we think of as an image of war. And this image is from a few days ago, the 1st of March 2026, following US and Israeli strikes in Iran. This is in Iran. So why are these the types of images that we see? I think it's because they're the easiest types of images to get. The physical, it's obvious what they represent, and the photographer can be there. They are easy to get. It's a lot harder to get photographs and convey messages when it's a cyber attack, or when it's illicit finance, or even when it's physical action, kinetic action, in my domain, at sea or in space. Because there is no one there. Very few people out. You don't see it. You don't get the imagery. You don't get that conception of war passed on to the general public. So, got to put my glasses back on now. So if we zoom out historically, I think we can find patterns that look rather different than we see than we most often view them today. So take, for example, the 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453. It's not, they couldn't even do maths. It's more than 100 years. This is a painting by Julian Russell Story, and it's of the Black Prince at the Battle of Crécy. So those people fighting in the 100 Years' War, those who were caught up in battle, could experience and did experience death and devastation. But for long periods of time in that war, around that series of conflicts that later became called a long war, or in remote parts of the kingdoms that were at war, like rural Lancashire, life carried on in a very different and very normal way. People farmed, people traded, people married, people had kids. They went about their day-to-day lives. The economic consequences from taxation would probably reach every village and every town. But the fighting didn't. So in other words, war is not always total. It can coexist with normality, and it can be chronic and not just acute. Are we in a chronic war at the moment? And is it the case that the main impact on most people, wherever they live, will be on high tax in terms of high taxes? So, for my day job, I'm editing the RUSI journal, so forgive me for blatantly advertising my day job. But if you do want to join RUSI, very reasonable prices available, and you get a great journal every couple of months. I've put these up because, and these were before my time as editor. If we only recognise war as it looked in 1939 to 1945 or around that period, or even today in parts of Ukraine, we risk missing other forms of violence and coercion. We risk treating them as peacetime incidents or competition long after they've crossed into something which is much closer to warfare. And so part of my argument now is that we need to expand our concept of war. Think of space, intelligence, sabotage, disinformation, weapon proliferation. And it's about reframing or recovering perhaps an older sense of war from modern age. There will be losses, there will be degradation, there will be cost, but there may be no declarations of war. And this might all be happening as we take our kids to school. So I think that the place that this is most apparent today may well be at sea, in terms of the deep war and the invisibility of the war, including places like the High North. But it is also being brought into focus today, this hour, in the Gulf and just outside. So, which of these images shows war? They are both ships sunk by hostile action. One is deemed to be war and one isn't. Can you tell the difference? The one on the left is the Russian ship Moskva, sunk by Ukraine in 2022, and we report that as a casualty of war. On the right is the Eternity Sea, sunk by the Houthis in the southern Red Sea in 2025. That's reported as a threat to ship owners. But let's think of the United States, Israel, Iran for a moment. Think of cyber action, the use of air power to strike nuclear infrastructure, to strike leadership in a decapitation strategy, to hit command and control nodes, naval assets, and populations. And Iran's response with missiles and drone attacks and by signaling and trying to close the Strait of Hormuz. And tankers have been hit and sunk, and others have been harassed. So what we see at the moment is, in the Middle East, is a classic example, I think, of a regional confrontation spilling over into the maritime domain and having global economic consequences. Has anyone noticed petrol prices going up yet? I think they'll probably go up a little bit more in the next few days and weeks. So, this is a picture that I took myself. I was lucky enough to be invited to an event in Parliament at the end of last year, in Speaker's House, and this was an Iranian Shahad 136 drone being displayed in Parliament. It had been recovered by the Poles, and the chap on the left-hand side of the picture is Radek Sikorski, the Polish Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister. It had been fired by the Russians against Ukraine and recovered from the battlefield, and had now made its way. It was on tour and had made its way into the House of Parliament in London. Iranian drone fired by Russia, recovered against Ukraine, recovered by the Poles on tour of Western capitals. Some colleagues of mine, I don't like the abbreviation particularly, but some colleagues of mine talk of the CRINC, a loose alliance of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Spell it out, it's CRINC. But it's probably true to say that the Iranian crisis or war is intertwined with other wars going on at the moment. What will be the effect on the Russia-Ukraine war of US-Israeli attacks and a potentially regime change or potentially not in Iran. Will the flow of of Iranian drones and parts for drones into Russia continue? Will the price of oil go up? Yes. Will that harm or help Russia? Probably help. Where does China get most of its oil from? So all of these things are interconnected. So Iran has been a central supplier of drones, we know that. And a lot of the drone components are Chinese, and we know that. Iran has helped Russia to establish manufacturing capacity, we know that. And Russia needs Iran, we know that. But Russia's diplomatic margin now to support Iran is very narrow, because any jolt in the energy markets that happens because of action in the Gulf affect everything else. They affect Russia, China, the Arab monarchies, India. It's complicated. It affects everything. It's all interconnected. So how do we try to piece all that together? We piece it together hopefully by having a bit of strategic thinking and logic. So returning to my comfort zone and a bit of maritime strategy. So I think what we can observe is not a single neatly bounded war, but a set of entangled confrontations across different theatres. So in the Gulf, we have air and missile strikes around Hormuz. In the Black Sea, we have Russian attempts to strangle Ukrainian exports and counterattacks. In the Red Sea, we have targeting of specific commercial shipping by Iranian proxies. In the China Seas, east and south, we have water space grabs and militarization by the People's Republic. In the High North, it may be a little quieter at the moment, but we still have a lot of important competition taking place focused on cables and pipelines and subsea activity, including military naval submarines. So different theatres, different dynamics, but the same logic throughout. And it's all about control of choke points, protection of infrastructure, targeting of infrastructure for leverage, and what many people call persistent grey zone activity. So why are the seas such an attractive environment for this kind of confrontation or war? And to quote a former American president, it's the economy, stupid. So the seas are structurally central to the global economy. Shipping routes, energy, data, food. The seas are the circulation system of the world. Yeah, I'm back into my sort of naval comfort zone and saying the cloud's not in the sky, the cloud's under the sea. And sea power is all about the movement of stuff. People, military hardware, power, energy, data, food. It's about moving things. And so it's either about enabling things to be moved or stopping things being moved. And that's the simplicity of sea power. That's it. Something moves or it doesn't, because we're never going to live there as huge populations. And then, as I said at the beginning, the maritime domain also then provides a physical distance from where people are and what people can see. And it allows political ambiguity. It's hard to see, as we've said, and it's hard to explain because we're not getting those simple, straightforward images. And of course, I think that navies are a tool of statecraft, and we can come back to that later, it's my pet subject. But it's hard to explain because who's watching and who's seeing that when all that people seem to be interested in is what's sunk, who's been killed, and so on. But the movement of stuff across the seas is really important. So, to make sense of that picture, what I want to do is use three analytical lenses: strategic studies, how states use force or threats of force to pursue political aims. And here I think there's a question of where these maritime activities sit on the spectrum, if there is a spectrum of peace, competition, crisis, conflict, war. Second, how do the law of the sea and other international laws apply to things like sabotage of infrastructure, interdiction of shadow fleets, blockades, or closing choke points? And third, policy. How are states actually organising, equipping, and using the maritime forces? And we could argue that procurement plans are probably more candid than political speeches. What are we actually doing? So let's have a quick look at the high north, where geography and geopolitics and climate change and technology combine to intersect in quite an awkward way. So the Kola Peninsula and Barents Sea, home to the Russian Northern Fleet and its nuclear bastions, where Russian nuclear submarines operate. But for those Russian submarines to get into the North Atlantic, into what the Russians and the Soviets before them called the world ocean, they have to get through NATO-controlled choke points. There's the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, which many people will have heard of, GR-UK gap, or go further north and east, Svalbard, Bear Island, pretty close to Russia. Or on the other side of the Arctic, the Bering Strait, between Alaska and the Russian Far East. So these are not battlegrounds in a classic sense today, but they are precisely where a collision or a miscalculation or a suspicious incident around some subsea cables could have and will have and has had global consequences. Because these things are happening, and they're happening today. So I want to dwell for a moment on subsea infrastructure, because it is important. Because it shows to me how war is changing. And it's where I want to focus on when I talk about the deep war, or I did before Iran all kicked off. So think about cables and pipelines under the Baltic and the North Sea. Think about energy, first of all, and wind farms in the Irish Sea. When the Nord Stream 2 pipeline mysteriously exploded in 2022, it wasn't just an environmental disaster, it was an economic and strategic shock. So today, any actor on the world stage with relatively low-level capabilities can have an incredibly far-reaching effect. The barriers to entry in strategic terms have lowered massively in recent years due to the proliferation of technology. The Nord Stream 2 incident completely changed the European energy structures and markets. And eventually, it was one of the stepping stones on the road to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. This picture shows, doesn't show that particular thing, but this picture shows the Sea Line 1 cable damage in the Baltic in November 2024. This is when a Chinese freighter, the Yipeng, dragged an anchor across a cable and broke it. Because some of these things are, was that an accident? Some of these things are ambiguous. But we've had a pattern of incidents involving subsea data cables being cut or damaged, and they seem to be a little bit more than coincidence. In a number of cases, unusual vessel behaviour has been seen. So we've talked about dragging anchors, drifting over cables for kilometres. And it's often impossible, publicly at least, to prove malicious intent. And very often it can be explained away with very technically and with technical feasibility and customary practice. What we have is plausible deniability. We have ambiguity. Let me just explain this one. I've taken out the name. If I've left the name somewhere, I've made a mistake. So I was contacted at the weekend by the Times newspaper to make comments because they'd been following the story and they had tracked this this vessel. It was a part of the Shadow Fleet, the Ghost Fleet, Greek-owned, operated by other nationalities, and it was on a steady series of runs between Russia and world markets, presumably carrying sanctioned, in this case, liquid natural gas. This vessel stopped and drifted for a few days, in the Celtic Sea, just off the coast of Wales, between Wales and Ireland, in a place that coincidentally has a lot of subsea cables going over it, or going through it. No damage was done. There was no belief that this vessel had any capability to map those cables or do any damage other than if it dragged an anchor. But what was it doing there? This story, partly because Iran kicked off and high priorities took over, but this story didn't get published. And it didn't get published because the shipping company's lawyers got in touch with the newspaper when they were asked for comment and made lots of legal threats. And in the end, there wasn't enough certainty to run the story, so it wasn't run. Maybe it will be in future, maybe it won't. And it wasn't even a story saying that this ship was doing anything. It was a story to say, look, this is the kind of thing that is happening and has happened elsewhere. And when it happened elsewhere, damage occurred. But this is the kind of thing that goes on week by week, day by day, and it doesn't always make the news. However, sometimes it does make the news, and we shouldn't believe in coincidence. There is a cumulative pattern that suggests major powers and the proxies are mapping, probing our responses, and sometimes interfering with subsea infrastructure, including cables and pipelines. And they're doing it in ways that would have been unthinkable in peacetime just a decade ago. So the activities of the Russian, I can do some air quotes, the Russian deep sea research ship Yantar, also known in the press sometimes as a spy ship, have been well documented. They've been in the press a lot, and the media likes to get great photographs, especially things like the one on the left with a Type 45 destroyer in front of it, escorting or monitoring what the Yantar is doing in the British exclusive economic zone. The same kind of Type 45 that is now en route to Cyprus to protect RAF Akrotiri. But that's a misleading image because that ship is doing nothing more than providing a visible presence. It's not going to sink the Yantar. Much more interesting, much more relevant is a photograph on the right, which shows in these terms, a more important ship, Proteus. So a ship operated now by the Royal Navy, specifically procured for the protection of critical undersea infrastructure. Doesn't make the news very often that our country is investing in such capabilities, but it is, but there aren't enough of them. And so this today, I think, is the hidden maritime front line. I'll skip through some of these because with events in the Middle East, these are probably being overtaken by events. But subsea infrastructure is one thing, but interactions between ships, platforms, aircraft, on, over, and under the sea are another thing. And over the past decade or so, we've seen an increasing pattern of hazardous encounters between Russian and American vessels and between American and Chinese vessels and aircraft. Maritime patrol aircraft flying in international airspace, and this one is over the Mediterranean, have been intercepted by fighter aircraft at very close range. So this is an American patrol aircraft, and that's a Russian fighter. And if you can see the outline of a human being in the cockpit, then you've got to imagine you're pretty close. And I don't think they're using a zoom lens on that one. And the same thing has happened with surface ships. These things are usually followed by diplomatic protests, but they rarely hit the headlines unless someone has some footage, and it has to be dramatic footage to make the news. But they matter because they raise the base level of risk acceptability, and they push the boundaries of rules of engagement. So they're close to the edge. And when we talk about rules of engagement, we've had in the past day or so the US Secretary of Defense / Secretary of War calling rules of engagement stupid. Doesn't think that they are important. So these pictures also show unsafe encounters, the same deliberate practice but further east. On the left is a Chinese helicopter flying, I think, ridiculously close to a Philippine patrol aircraft. And on the right are two China Coast Guard vessels using water cannon against a Philippine Navy-operated but civilian chartered ship. That was last May. That ship was trying to resupply the second Thomas Shoal, which is an area in the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. The Philippine Navy keeps about a dozen Marines there in an old landing craft. They claim it as they hold a territorial claim there, and so does China, and China is trying to interfere. This is happening all the time. But let's look quickly beyond the major powers. This picture shows a cable landing site in Gabon in West Africa. So I'll just put this one up so you get a sense of what a cable actually is and what it looks like and how easy it would be to do damage. These are not huge things. They are literally cables. It was a few years ago, but an entire country, Mauritania, was left offline for 48 hours after the ACE cable was severed, probably by a trawl. It was in 2018. And 9 other African countries were affected to a lesser extent, but still significantly. Imagine being offline, your entire country being offline for 2 days. Imagine the impact on finance, on getting money from the bank, on paying for anything at a shop, on filling your car full of petrol, on contacting loved ones, on finding out what's going on. And then think about resilience and where we are. I don't have time to talk extensively about shadow fleets, and they've been in the news a lot over since the Ukraine war started, and we can perhaps come back to this in Q&A. But let's remind ourselves of one incident that I think characterises the way that things are going. So late last year, early this year, there was a shadow fleet tanker, the Bella 1, sailing under a flag of convenience, which then reflagged to Russia, but it was owned by a Greek company, and it was pursued and intercepted by US forces. Russia, as a flag state, objected, and the ship was then brought to the UK. So that takedown, interdiction, was on the high seas. It was non-consensual, and as far as we know, that ship at the time had no sanctioned cargo on board. And so arguably, it was an unlawful interdiction. But who is right and who is wrong isn't really that important. What's important, it shows that when a great power decides to do something, it can ignore established norms, and that could open the door for others to do the same in return. So, from a strategic studies perspective, what does that leave us? So there's a classic picture of a spectrum, peace, competition, crisis, limited war, total war. But the activities, the things that I've been talking about, that we've been discussing, they sit awkwardly on that spectrum. So, and I'm not even sure that a spectrum analogy is right anymore. Another way to think about it, about all of these things, is as a rehearsal. So, under the cover of, in inverted commas, peace, different states, different actors are rehearsing striking infrastructure, conducting blockades, closing choke points, doing lots of things. And in UK maritime doctrine, or in defence doctrine, a rehearsal is still an operation. So another way to think about it, another way to see it, is as cumulative coercion. No single incident amounts to a declaration of war, but together they test capabilities, they raise the cost, they confuse decision makers, and they degrade our resilience. Death by 1,000 cuts is still death. My argument is there is no line between competition and war. International law is under strain. Does international law exist? International law only operates by consent, and if the most powerful states no longer consent, then where does that leave us? The law of the sea was designed to balance the rights of coastal states with freedom of navigation. The UN Charter talks about force and armed attack and self-defense. The San Remo Manual of Naval Law covers naval operations and so on. But when you talk about sabotage, coercion, harassment, and forms of blockade, and a right is right mentality, where do those laws or those norms fall and apply? And I think that states are answering these questions quite practically. They're answering them by stretching or deliberately misinterpreting or ignoring international law at sea because they can. Policy and practice is adapting. In the High North and the North Atlantic, NATO navies, including the UK, are investing in undersea surveillance, seabed monitoring, infrastructure protection capabilities. And many exercises now regularly include scenarios that involve suspected cable damage and sabotage and hybrid attacks. So it gets the commanders thinking. But Russia has strengthened its Arctic posture, and it's invested in its northern fleet and coastal defences and Arctic capabilities, even while it was fighting in Ukraine. And in and around the Strait of Hormuz, navies are learning or relearning in real time the art of escorting trade because they have to. And so the same platforms, the same ships and aircraft might one day be escorting, another day protecting cables, another day engaging drones or firing missiles at land targets. And so navies or the political masters actually now have to make some strategic choices. And every time you make a strategic choice, you're probably going to pick the wrong one. Perhaps we can come back to that. Why is it taking so long to get a destroyer into the Mediterranean to protect Cyprus? This slide, I've stolen this slide from everyone's favourite geopolitical analysis publication. It's called The Sun. It's from late 2025, so this is only a few months ago. Look how many of the Sun's 5 flashpoint indicators are maritime in nature. Now start ticking off how many have happened. They were asking if war is looming. How many do you need to tick off before you say war is here? But, right, so don't worry. This is my only slide with real words on it, and you're not meant to read them. I put this up because this is International Committee of the Red Cross, fantastic organisation that has done incredible work over the years. Is this old-fashioned, pre-Trump, pre-Ukraine, pre-Iran, pre-AI, pre-autonomy, pre-Greenland? Is this legalese of any validity today? I think the world may have moved on, but the lawyers haven't caught up yet. And I've argued this with some naval lawyer friends. Again, very happy to come back to that in Q&A. This is a doctrine slide from the Australian Army. So nice colours, we like colour, but you'll find it something very similar to this in every staff college around the world, certainly every Western one. I know I used to run the Advanced Command and Staff course in the UK, and we use this kind of stuff all the time. Basically, if you look at the red bit, basically, it's defining war as a condition when violence is the primary means of political coercion. Do we agree with that? What about trade wars? What about economic warfare? What about the threat of violence before violence is used? What about tariffs? If hostile acts at sea and from the sea or in other domains deliberately degrade national capabilities and economies and threaten critical infrastructure and sink commercial shipping and reduce societal resilience, do they constitute a form of war? If we answer no, then I think what we risk doing is normalizing a world in which chronic aggression is tolerated as the price of doing business. We accept that pipelines will mysteriously explode, that data cables will be cut, and our financial and health and education services will be shut down for short periods of time. We will accept that merchant ships will be boarded, perhaps by modern privateers, and that naval vessels will be attacked, even if it's only by water cannon. But if we answer yes, this does constitute war, then what we have to do, I think, is confront some uncomfortable truths and consequences. Because we will be living in an era of overlapping wars that most of the public haven't yet recognised. That say that our legal arguments are out of date and that our political institutions are not equipped to deal with them. So how do we change that? So, What should we do? Don't know. Okay, let's think. What should we do? Conceptually, I think we need greater clarity. Terms like grey zone and hybrid war can be useful, but they can also obscure rather than illuminate. We might need to think, move beyond this terminology and move beyond images of Saving Private Ryan. Operationally, resilience is key. Resilience in the private sector, energy and data, and perhaps greater transparency between government and private sector operators, and better shared situational awareness. Because these infrastructures that are being targeted and damaged don't belong to the taxpayer. They belong to companies and are paid for by consumers. And that's sometimes a tricky thing to deal with. So let me finish by returning to a bit of history. So if we insist that war must always look like something from 1939 to 1945, or like a Hollywood sci-fi film, we will continue to underestimate the significance of what we are living through. In earlier eras, war coexisted for decades or centuries with normality. The pattern of chronic campaigns, intermittent crises, and geographically uneven violence is not new. What is new is the speed of the technology behind it all. But I'm biased. I think that the seas, the oceans, are a microcosm or a testing ground for this reality, precisely because they're out of sight, out of mind. They are conduits for the movement of stuff, whatever that may be, and they're only governed, if they're governed at all, by the consent of states. And today it seems that all states are out just for their own national interest.